Hey everyone, welcome back to Code with Row. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to create this 2D sprite that runs and jumps around in Unreal Engine 5.3. And this is pretty much how you start making a 2D game. And let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is over in my library, I'm going to make sure that I have Paper ZD installed. And I already installed it to my Unreal Engine 5.3. As of making this video, it's not available in 5.4. And then in my 5.3 project, I'll hit launch. And I'll go to games and then I'll start from a blank project and I'll just call this paper tutorial and I'll hit create. Now I'm going to hold control and click N to create a new map, or you can just go to file, new level, and I'll do a basic one. Now I'm going to save this by using control S and then I'll create a new folder called maps and I'll just call this demo. And I'll open my content drawer and I'll actually dock this in the layout. And a few things before we start developing our paper characters is you're going to go to edit and then project settings. You're going to look for motion blur and turn that off. And then look for default pixel per Unreal unit and set this to 0.25 to make it look a little bigger. And then we're going to look for anti-aliasing. Spelled that really wrong. And then the anti-aliasing method will be FXAA. So fast approximate anti-aliasing. And then once that's done, you can exit out of project settings. And then you're going to go back to edit and go to plugins. And then you're going to make sure that Paper 2D and Paper ZD are both enabled. And by default, Paper ZD is not enabled. So I'll hit the check and then I'll click restart to restart my Unreal Engine. And now that the editor's restarted, now what we need to do next is download our generic character asset. And I got this free one off itch.io. It comes with all the sprites, animation. It shows some little previews, which are really nice. It tells us what's included. And then you're just going to hit download now. You can support it if you want, or just click no thanks, take me to the download. It's a free download. Hit download over here, and I'll download a .zip that you can just extract to your desktop. And now that it's extracted to my desktop, I'm just going to drag and drop. Actually, I'll create a folder first. Call this player. I'm going to open up this folder and just drag and drop everything inside over here. I'll exit out of that. And now with the PNGs given, you can pretty much select what color character you want. So for example, the green one has like green shirts, and then the red one has red shirts, and so on. And we're going to be making sprite animations with these images. So now what you can do is select your Care Blue 1, Care Blue 2, and then right click. And then for sprite actions, you can apply Paper 2D texture settings. And this is just so that it's a lot more clear. And without doing this, your pixel characters will look really blurry. And now I'm going to right click on Care Blue 1 and then sprite actions, and then I'll extract sprites. And for the sprite extract mode, I'm going to set this from auto to grid. And the developer or the artist actually set that the cell width and height are going to be 56 by 56. And the reason why we set this is because this is the exact ground for every single tile, so it's made evenly. So it looks like the character is always on the ground according to these width lines or these grid lines. And then I'll hit extract. And now it'll create a bunch of sprites, which are just images. And you'll see that if I just drag this into the open like this, it's going to be a still image here. And what we're going to do is select multiple sprites and create a flipbook. So for example, if I select these, so for me, it's sprite underscore 5, 4, 3, 2, 0. And then I right click this and I'll create a flipbook called FB underscore idle. And if I hover over it, you'll see this idle animation play. And if I just place it over here, you can also see it live time in game. And we're pretty much just going to break apart these sprite animations in order to make a bunch of flipbooks, which will be our character's animations. So I'll actually move this flipbook to another folder for assets. So I'll create a new folder under player called, actually I'll call this animation. And I'll just move that flipbook over here. So we've created the idle one. And now the run animation is going to be seen to, I believe, 24. So I'll create this flipbook and call it FB run. So you can see that it's kind of clipping and it's not looping perfectly. So it looks like I messed up. I actually added an extra one at the end. I'm going to delete that. So it's going to be 16 to 23. So now it's looping perfectly. Yeah, so this is the run one, or the run animation. So I'll set that here. And then for this one, 24 to 29, I'll create this as FB jump rise. And then from here to here, I'll do create flipbook, and this will be my FB jump fall. And I'll just stick with those for now, I think. So now I'm going to go to my player folder and I'm going to right click and create a blueprint class. And I'll search under all classes and call this BP player, but what we want is to find a paper character or a paper ZD character. And I'll call this BP player. And then I'll go back and then I'll create a blueprint class of I'll create a game mode base and I'll call this BP game mode. And then after creating the BP game mode, I'm just going to create a player controller and I'll call this BP player controller. And now in my game mode, I'm just going to select my BP player controller that I created for my player controller class. And then for my pawn, I'm going to change this to BP player. And I'm going to hit compile and save. And then I can exit out of my BP game mode. Now in my BP player, I'm going to select sprite. And I can just select my flipbook idle. And you'll see that my capsule component is not aligned, so I can just move it up. And it's actually a little big, so I'm going to make this a little smaller. And I just want to make sure that I'm perfectly on top of the ground. I'll just leave it like this for now. Compile, save. And when I go to demo, what I want to do is actually drag in a player start. And I don't have a camera set up, so I'm actually going to have to go back and do that. And now when you have the BP player selected, you can click add and then search for a spring arm, which is going to be the holder for the camera. And then while this is selected, I'll click add and I'll search for camera. Now let's click on the spring arm and we'll rotate it. We can click E on the keyboard and rotate it in front of the character. So we'd want to rotate it 90 degrees from the spring arm like this, or just change it here on the rotation to -90. And since we are creating pixel art since we're creating pixel art, we're going to have to select the camera and change it from perspective to orthographic. If you're going to have a 2D background, change it to orthographic. But if you are doing a 2.5D, which in my case, I'm having a 3D background, then you can leave this as perspective. And then hit compile and save. And for the purpose of this tutorial, or I'm actually going to extend the spring arm bit. I don't want it to be this close to my pixel character. So I'm just going to make the target arm length probably like 500. And then I also might have to shrink my sprite a little bit in the capsule. If you already created the new map, it should have a player start. If you don't, you can just go to the place actors window and then drag one in. Don't forget to set your game mode to your BP game mode that you created. Save the demo. And then when you hit play, you're going to see your character spawn in. So I'm actually going to change my spring arm. I'm going to actually increase the size of my character a bit. I'll just leave it as default. And now we have this 2D character just idling on by. But I'm actually going to raise the camera a little bit from the spring arm and rotate it to adjust the y-axis to feel like probably -20, I think. Hopefully it's not too high. Oh, that is too high. So -10 was actually a better call. And yeah, that actually looks a lot better. So now let's create some input actions and movement for our character. And what we're going to do is I'll create a new folder and I'll call this actions. Then I'm going to right click and just create input. And I'll create two things, the input mapping context. So I'll call this IMC. I'll just leave this as IMC. And then as my input, I'm going to add a couple input actions. So one will be IA, which stands for input actions. And I'll call this movement. And then another one called jump. And that's it for now. And now in my IA movement, I'm going to change this to a axis 2D vector, which is for 3D stuff. And if you are just doing a pixelated background on a 2D platform, you would keep this as an axis 1D. So I'll change this to axis 2D for my case, since mine's going to be more 2.5D. And I'll just do that, hit save. I can cancel out of that. And then I'll go back, go to my jump. And I'll leave this as a digital bool, save. And then when I open my IMC, my input mapping context, I'm going to add my IA movement and I'm going to add my jump. Now for under my IA movement, I'm going to actually add 4 mappings. So I'm just going to hit this keyboard in order to select the key instead of searching for it in this dropdown. So when I click W, ASD, they'll all come up in whatever order I select. So I'll hit this keyboard and then I'll hit D. And then for this one, I'll do A. This one, I'll do W. This one, I'll do S. And for my D, I won't actually do anything with it. I'll minimize this. And for my A, I'll add a modifier and set this to negate. And then for my W, I will add a modifier, which is a swizzle input axis values. And then for my S, I will add two modifiers, which is going to be my swizzle and negate. And then for my jump, I should actually call this IA jump, not just jump, just for better practice and readability. I'm going to hit this keyboard, select space, and yeah, that's it. Now I'm going to go over back to my player and under my animation, I'm actually going to right click and under paper ZD, I'm going to create an animation source. So I'll just call this AS underscore main player, and you can call this whatever you want. Just make sure it references the character that we're doing. So it can be like AS underscore warrior or whatever. And then I'm going to hit add new animation sequence. And then I'll rename this by hitting F2 on it. And I'll call this fall. Then I'll add another one called idle and another one called jump rise and another one called run. And now when I double click run, I'm going to select my FB underscore run. Now if I zoom out, you'll see my character running in an animation. And also, if you want to slow this down, if this is going too fast, you can go to your flipbook and you can change the FPS, the frames per second, to something like 10 to slow it down, even like 1, which might look a little bad. You can also make it a lot faster by setting it really high. And for this tutorial, I'll just leave it at 15, which is the default value. And make sure that if you do set the FPS of this to something else, then all the other ones should probably match too, or else it will look a little janky. And now back in your AS underscore main player, I will hit save. And if you need to add like footstep notifiers, you would do this right here in our track. And then I'll double click jump rise, and then I'll select my FB underscore jump rise. And then I'll double click idle, and then I'll select the idle flipbook, and then I'll double click fall, and then I'll select my FB jump fall, which might need to change, but I'm going to have to double check on that. So I'll file save all just to make sure these are all saved. And now I'm going to go back and I'll create under paper ZD, I'm going to create a paper ZD anim BP, paper ZD anim BP, and pick a parent animation source. And it's going to be the AS main player that we just created. And I'll call this main player underscore ABP, or actually ABP underscore main player. And now what this is going to do is we're going to basically initialize from here. So we can get rid of the event on tick and leave. And with the event on in it, we're actually just going to cast to our BP player. And then I'll promote this as BP player to a variable. And I'll call this, I'll rename this to main player. And then for the object, I'm going to drag this out and look for get owning actor. And before we get into the locomotion side, which is our anim graph over here, I'm actually going to go back to my BB player. And in the event graph, I need to start creating that movement system. So first, what we want to do is on begin play, we're going to basically cast to our player controller. And then we're going to add the mapping context, which is this, which is going to be our controls. So on begin play, right click, and I'll call the parent function. And then I'll cast to our BP player controller. And then I'll drag out the object and get the controller. And our target is going to be our pawn. And then as BP controller, I'm actually going to look for our enhance input local player subsystem. And then I'll drag this out and then do add mapping context. Or I'll drag this one out and do add mapping context. And now we can select for our mapping context, we can select our IMC file that we created, our input mapping context, and hit save and compile. Compile and save. And now I'll delete these two for the actor begin overlap and event tick. And then I'll create the enhanced input action movement, or I'll just type in underscore or IA underscore movement. And I'll open this up with this down arrow sign so that I can see everything. And I am just going to, so when triggered, so basically when we click WASD, we're going to add movement input. And it's going to be two ways. So left and right and up and down. So I'm just going to copy paste this again. So we need two of these so that one can determine up and down, one can determine left and right. So basically, we just need to set our X and Y axis. So for the action value, I'm going to drag this out and add a break vector 2D. And then for our X value, we'll adjust that for the first one. And then for the Y value, we'll adjust that to the scale value of the second one. And then I'll set the X to 1 for the first, and then I'll set the Y to -1. So now if I go back to the demo, compile and save. If I go back to the demo and hit play, you can see my character just kind of sliding around. The animation doesn't change, but I can go left, I can go right. And it looks really weird because, well, the animation's not playing. And when I slide left, it doesn't actually face left. So in order to fix that, I'm going to go over to my BP player, and under functions, I'm going to add a function called update rotation, or update controller rotation. And in my update controller rotation, I'm going to compare float, and I'll drag out my character movement. And then I want to get the velocity. And I'll scroll all the way down and find this get velocity with a yellow bar next to it. And then I'm going to right click the velocity and split the struct spin. Split struct spin. And this pretty much just separates our X, Y, Z because we only want to test our left. Our left and right is only going to be determined by our X axis. And now if it's greater, then we're going to see if it's valid by checking the following. So we want to get the controller and make sure the target is pawn. And then we just want to set our control rotation. And then we'll drag this new rotation off and call a make rotator, which is going to be at the very bottom. And we'll leave this as all 0. And now we're going to copy this and paste it down here. And then if less than for the compare float, then we're going to make him turn left, basically. So now what we're going to want to do is just set our Z axis, our yaw, to 180. So if that doesn't work for you, then you might need to change this to the Y, to the pitch. So this is really dependent on where your camera is and what angle you start at, whether your game starts this way or this way. And now if I hit Control Save and compile, so this is all we need for these. And when I go back to my event graph, after my IA movement, I'm basically just going to call the update control rotation right after this. I've seen other tutorials call update controller rotation on an event tick. Do not do that. It is not performant friendly. I know it's just a pixel 2D game, but it's not recommended. Unreal Engine is a heavy application anyways. And yeah, it's just not good practice to use event ticks. So compile and save, go to your demo, click play. And now when I hit left, so when I hit left, you're going to see my camera is actually changing. And you can tell from the sky that whole sky is changing. If that's happening to you, you're just going to go to your BP player, under your spring arm, under your transform, change your rotation to world, and then hit compile and save. And now when you hit play and you turn left, your character is just going to turn left. And now it looks a lot better, but now let's get the animations working. So now this is going to be the tricky part. Not really tricky, but if you're new to Unreal Engine, this might get a little confusing, but it's all going to make sense once it actually works for you. So now in my ABP main player, my animation blueprint, next to event graph, you're going to see this anim graph. And if you don't see it, you can click it on the left here. So I'll double click into my anim graph, and this is going to be the output animation. So I'm just going to drag this out, and I'll create add a new state machine, and I'll call this Locomotion. And I'll double click to go inside of it. And this is pretty much going to determine what we do in our idle state, jump state, fall state, run state, and so on. So now the first thing our character will be doing is we're going to create an animation state, and we're going to call this idle. And now if we double click into our idle state, we're just going to play that idle animation. And it's getting this idle animation from that AS_main player we created. So right here. So I compile and save, and I'll go back to my Locomotion. And next, I want it to go to our run state. So I'll create an animation state, and I'll call this run. And in here, I will just play the run animation. So we're doing the easy ones to get that out of the way first. And now we want to add basically two ways of idle going to run, and then also run going back to idle. And the way we're going to do this is you're just going to drag out from the bottom of the run back to the idle so that you'll see this arrow going left and right. And the first one we're going to configure is actually from idle to run. So I'll double click this, And now I'm going to drag out my main player. And then I want to get the velocity. And this is pretty much just going to be checking for the speed. And if our velocity, basically our movement. So if our velocity, we'll call a vector length. So we're going to check if our vector length is greater than 0. So add a greater than sign and then return. So if it's greater than 0, basically if we're, in this sense, if we're just moving, then we will start playing that run animation. And I can just copy paste this, go back to Locomotion, go down here to run to idle, and then I'll paste it. And now I'll just add a not Boolean, which is pretty much just inversing our whole thing. And then I'll hit compile and save. Now, if I go back to the demo and hit play, you're actually going to see nothing still happens. And that's because we didn't assign this ABP main player to our character. So if I go back to BP player and go to animation component and set the ABP main player under anim instance class and compile and save and then play, you're going to see that now my character actually runs and goes back to the idle. And now in our ABP, I'll hit Locomotion. And there are quite a few other states that I need to create. So from idle, we should be able to go to our jump rides. So I'll create another animation state and I'll call this jump rides. And then from our jump rides, we should be able to fall. So I'll create another animation state and call this fall. So now I'll create this jump rise. I'll double click into jump rise and I'll just play that jump rise animation. And then in the fall, we're just going to play that fall animation. And now in the locomotion of our idle to jump rise, I'm going to double click this for the transition rule. And we're going to get our main player and we're going to get our character movement. I'll scroll all the way down and then get our character movement variable. And we're going to check is moving on ground. And since we're rising, we're going to do a not Boolean because we want to make sure our character is not on the ground. And basically, if this is true, if the character is not moving on the ground, all of a sudden, then it's going to start playing the jump rise animation. And then I'll hit compile and save, go back to Locomotion. And then I want to go to the fall from jump rise to fall because after we come up, we have to come down. And I'll drag out the main player again, get main player, and then I'll get the velocity, get velocity all the way at the bottom. And I'll split my struct pin. And we're only going to be checking for the Z axis because that's our up and down direction. So I'm just going to do is less than equal to 0 or less than equal to and leave this as 0. Then we can enter this transition and we can start playing our jump fall animation. And after we fall, we should be able to come back into an idle state. So I'll double click the transition from fall to idle. And that's basically going to start playing when our character can start moving on the ground again. So I'll do main player and then I'll find the character movement and is moving on ground. Because that's going to be the reverse or the opposite of our rides. And the last one we need to create is our run to our jump rise because we want to be able to jump and rise while running. And now when I double click into run to jump rise, I want to make sure that the main player and get the character movement for the main player. And if it's moving on the ground, is moving on the ground. And if it's not true, which is the exact same thing we did for the idle state, then we can start playing this. And I'll hit compile and save. Now, one thing that we also need to do is in our BP, we've only set our IA movement, but we also need to set our IA jump, our input action of jumping. So I'll go to I'll right click and search for IA underscore jump. And I'll open this up. And in the event graph, all I want to do is when it's triggered, I just want to jump. And when it's completed, I just want to stop jumping. And I'll hit compile and save. And we already set the controllers for that in our IMC and our input action jump. And when I go to my demo and I hit play, now my character can move around pretty fluidly. So when I jump, it'll play that jumping animation. And now when I fall, it's going to look a little odd because it keeps looping. Oh, it actually just might be that looping. So we're going to go back to our ABP, and for our jump rise, we're going to turn off the loop animation. So go to Locomotion, jump rise, highlight play jump rise, and then turn off looping. And then go to Locomotion, go to fall, highlight fall, and turn off loop animation. And now when I play, okay, so my jump looks a lot better. It actually was not a flipbook error. So now it just looks like a really clean 2D pixel character moving around. And now when I jump off, it's just going to be stuck in this falling state, which is exactly what we want because it looks a lot more fluid. And that's a really simple way of making a papered 2D character in Unreal Engine. I'm not sure if I'll be continuing this series. If I get a lot of comments saying you guys want to see me make an actual 2D game using Paper ZD and Paper 2D in Unreal Engine, then I can definitely make a tutorial series on making a game out of this in a 2.5D or 2.5D environment, or even in just the 2D world. If that's something you're interested, comment down below. Thanks for watching this tutorial. Like, subscribe, and my Patreon is in the description below if you want to support my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.